Hello, everybody, and welcome to my talk, Blood, Sweat, Tears, and Design Systems. It is a slightly ominous title, as Luis already alluded to, but it will make sense later on, I promise. First things first, though, my name is James, and I'm a product designer at the tech consultancy Wildy. For those of you who are still unfamiliar with Wildy, we specialize in both software engineering and digital product design consultancy. And because of this, we've actually long been advocates of design systems. They're something we frequently recommend to our clients and actually help our clients to establish, deliver, and maintain. In fact, Wildy's advocacy for design systems ultimately led to the creation of the Design Systems London conference, which in turn has spawned this event. And it's been amazing to see how DSL has grown to become such a voice within the community. So massive thank you to everyone who's contributed to that. Now, when I joined Wildy back in 2017, I didn't know the first thing about design systems. I'd come from a much more traditional graphic and digital design background, and I was still just trying to find my feet within the discipline of digital product design. But fast forward to 2022, and I've spent the last 4 or 5 years working fairly extensively with design systems. And gradually, I've progressed to the point where I've been able to lead the creation of several design systems for some of Wildy's clients. Now, it's been a long and humbling journey to go from a complete novice to something of a veteran. Lots of lessons have been learned, and there are still lots of lessons to be learned, if I'm honest. So today I want to look back at my journey working with design systems, and I particularly want to focus on the different questions, struggles, and milestones that I've experienced. So hopefully this talk will be useful to any designers out there who are about to embark on their own journey with design systems. So I want to start by taking you all back to 2017. Wasn't a great year, so sorry about that. But it is where my design systems journey begins. Now, as I've said, when I joined Wildy, I didn't know anything about design systems. I pretty much just liked making UI. But around 2017, design systems began to make their way into the mainstream tech consciousness, and Wildy began to work on more and more projects that involved them in one form or another. And so design systems quickly became a subject of great interest to me due to their relationship with UI. And I spent my first few weeks at Wildy trawling through various articles, tutorials, and other people's sketch files, as was the fashion back then, just trying to get a better idea of what makes a design system. And one of the first problems I encountered was that design systems, as we know them within digital product design, are a fairly new discipline. And because of this, there's still a lot of ambiguity around them. There are certain things we can all agree should go into a design system and that make a design system, but there's equally a lot of things that are unclear. And a lot of this ambiguity revolves around the practical side of making a design system. So the real nuts and bolts stuff, really, of how you as a designer should go about establishing one. For instance, how should you organize your design files? How should you structure your components? What naming conventions should you use? How and what should you document? And how can you ensure consistent design decisions throughout? And all these unknowns mean it can be tempting to assume there's a very set way of creating a design system and to simply copy what has already been established by the likes of Polaris or Material Design or whoever. When in reality, design systems are not a one-size-fits-all solution. They each have their own unique quirks and idiosyncrasies, just as every product and organization does. So it's far more important that your design system reflects these nuances and aligns to the unique needs of your product and organization, rather than you just blindly following a big-name design system. Now, my first experience of actually working with design systems came a few months into my time at Wildy, when I was able to join a design systems-focused project and work under the tutelage of a more senior product designer. Shout out to Antonis if you're watching. And during my time on this project, I initially started out as a bit of a design system underling, kind of slaving away on our collective design files and very much learning on the job. But this gave me really valuable insights about things like different contribution processes and different ownership structures, including our team's transition from a centralized team to a more federated style approach. It helped me learn about things like grid systems and baseline grids to give underlying visual structure to components and to screens. And generally, it just helped me forge stronger relationships with engineers through a shared language and shared tools such as InVision and Storybook. Now, eventually that project wrapped, and no, it didn't actually wrap. It progressed, and I actually assumed full design ownership of the design system. without any real issues. And this was mainly due to the fact that I'd been so hands-on with the design system for so long that I had a really solid understanding of its different quirks and idiosyncrasies. And this understanding was vital for when I gradually handed over the design system to the client's internal designers and engineers. Now, eventually, that project wrapped, and various clients and months passed until I reached the next big milestone of my design systems journey in 2020. Again, sorry for taking you all back there. But this time, the project was a bit more intimidating, and it really forced me out of my comfort zone. So it involved me leading the establishment of a cross-platform design system from scratch, which was the first time that I'd led on a project of this size from the outset. And it was a very different experience being responsible for the underlying foundations and structure of things like style guides and component libraries, rather than having them already laid out for me. On top of this, the client actually liked to work with Figma, which I'd never used until that point. So all in all, I was doing a lot of things for the first time. And that meant this project posed a number of new questions and considerations for me. Now, these questions are not necessarily going to blow your mind with their complexity, but they are a true reflection of some of the unknowns that you face when you're first establishing a design system in Figma. So some of the key questions I had were as follows. Firstly, what's the best file structure to adopt? And when I say file structure, I mean, how should you organize your design system files so that it's easy for designers and engineers and any other stakeholder to find components, foundational elements, or any other documentation? How should you manage different cross-platform considerations and your components? So different platforms obviously have different interactions that require different components. It could be web and app, or iOS and Android, whatever. But what can you do to easily distinguish one platform set of components from another platform set of components? How can you construct highly flexible components? So as designers, we all know that things change, particularly visuals. It could be because of user feedback, or as was the case on this project, because of a larger company rebrand. But is there an optimum way that you can actually construct your components so that you can make these kind of sweeping visual changes if needed? What's the best way of implementing and communicating atomic principles? So in particular, ensuring the relationship between new components and existing components is explicitly clear to both designers and engineers. What's the best way of managing variants in Figma? So variants are a great time and space saver, but they're also one more thing that needs to be managed so you don't end up with multiple instances of the same variant type. And this is particularly relevant if you're planning on actually replicating your Figma variant namings in something like Storybook. And finally, how can you ensure a consistent visual language? So because of the granular nature of design systems, it can sometimes be tricky to know if you're actually establishing a visual language that's consistent and replicable. Ultimately, you don't want to be in a situation where you start putting screens together and it just looks like a total Frankenstein. So all these questions actually came up during this project, and I tried my best to answer them as I saw fit, but sometimes as a consultant, and particularly as a more junior consultant, which I was back then, it can be hard to reconcile the fact that there are things that you don't know or that you may need to explore further. Now, again, months passed and the project wrapped, and again, thankfully, I was able to hand over the design system without any real issues, but I still had this nagging feeling that I needed to explore some of these questions a bit more thoroughly. So I thought, I know, I'll create my own design system, or at least the style guide and component library parts, and it'll only be accessible to me so I can just have a right good mess around and try and come up with some answers to these questions. So I started to work on what would become known solely to me as Supple UI. Now, Supple UI was fairly rudimental. You can see some screens that have been assembled using it here, but it did allow me to start stress testing my ideas and come up with some answers. For instance, my preferred Figma file structure was to have one library file that basically had all the different foundational elements, components, and other miscellaneous aspects on their own individual pages, as you can see in the sidebar. I found that it just made everything a lot clearer and easier to locate with, just more obvious separation. In the event, though, that I did have to manage different cross-platform considerations, I would create separate files for each platform's components, but use one overarching style guide file. To ensure the highest level of flexibility in my components, I constructed them all using a parent or master components, which I then branched off of. And this basically meant that if I wanted to make changes to something like the text size or paddings or corner radiuses, I just needed to make them to the master UI component, and it would cascade down throughout all instances of the same component. When I was implementing atomic design principles, I would always start by trying to group relevant atoms and molecules together as variants, if appropriate. So, for example, things like your radio select icon with your radio button. The accessibility isn't as bad as it looks on that screen. I found that organisms usually warranted being their own separate component, however. And when I actually did nest different components within one another, I would actually include a reference that linked to the existing component in Figma. So there was a really clear lineage that both designers and engineers could follow. For variants, I made sure to stick to and document consistent naming conventions, and this meant I obviously didn't repeat or contradict myself, and I actually wound up creating a separate terminology section in Figma that documented all the different naming conventions, so things for sizing, for variants, for layer names. And when it came to ensuring consistency in visual language, obviously things like color and type played a huge part, but one of the most important visual elements to consider in a design system is obviously space, both the space between and within your components. Now, systemizing the space between your components is fairly common and highly recommended, but what maybe doesn't get talked about as much is systemizing the space within your components, effectively your paddings, because this is a great way of actually maintaining consistent proportions across your UI, particularly when used in conjunction with a grid system, so whether that's 4-point, 6-point, 8-point, or whatever your point of choice. So around the same time that I was doing all this experimentation with supple UI, at Wildy we found that we kept getting projects that involved some form of design system, and it was quickly becoming apparent that across these different projects, we were largely rebuilding a lot of the same foundational elements, with most of this repetition simply involving best practice considerations. And gradually the idea of starting from scratch each time became a real bottleneck. There was a very clear instance where I was working with another product designer, and he was ready to start doing some lo-fi prototyping in Figma, and I was still assembling the first batch of UI components, so he basically just had to wait for me. So we couldn't help but think, wouldn't it be great to have some basic components and foundations ready to hand to use as a starting point to design from? Which brings me back to this quote from about 13 minutes ago by me. You might recall that I confidently stated that design systems are not a one-size-fits-all solution, and that they each have their own unique quirks and idiosyncrasies, just as every product and organization does. Now, the reason I bring this quote up is because it may occur to you that implementing pre-established components and foundations sounds like it contradicts my point about design systems being unique. So let me explain. Because at this stage, we didn't actually really need a fully fledged design system. What we needed as designers was a highly malleable style guide and component library that had all of our best practices built in and that would ultimately serve as the backbone to any future design systems work at Wildy. So with this in mind, the design team at Wildy got together and thought, we know, we'll create our own design system, or at least the style guide and component library parts. Now, this was a thought process I was very familiar with, and so I actually volunteered to lead the establishment of this white label design system. I'm doing air quotes because it's not a true design system yet. So at this point, you might be thinking that I'd surely use the work that I'd already done on supple UI as a starting point. But you'd actually be wrong. And the reason for that was that I'd never expected anybody else would ever use supple UI, so it was full of my own unchecked quirks and idiosyncrasies. And this presented a bit of an issue because at Wildy we wanted to ensure that whatever we created could be shared with the wider community. So rather than subject the wider community to my organized chaos, I decided to put supple UI on ice and ironically start again from scratch. Now at this stage you could argue, why start from scratch? Why not just repurpose an existing design system file from the Figma community or an existing component library like Chakra UI? And while we did consider this, we actually felt that not having full authorship could potentially really hinder us. For example, if something went wrong or was questioned by a client, we wouldn't automatically have the answers because we hadn't created the original work. And also, ultimately, we wanted whatever we created to actually reflect Wildy's quirks and idiosyncrasies. And additionally, we found that most design system files in the Figma community are fairly light on in-depth documentation and, crucially, the rationale of the design decisions that have been taken within them. Now, this is understandable, partly because this documentation sometimes lives elsewhere, but also because who likes writing documentation? But we did feel it was really important to give clear context to any design decisions that we made in our white label design system, so that other designers will be able to understand the how and the why of our decisions and subsequently make changes to them. So we're now in 2022. I hope it's been an all right year for everybody, which brings me to the most recent milestone of my design systems journey, which is the early stages work for YLD's white label design system, which is a bit of a mouthful of a name. So it's come to be known internally as Mothership. And the ultimate aim of Mothership is actually twofold. Firstly, it's to create a robust platform for all future YLD design systems work to be built on top of. And secondly, it's to actually educate and inform any designers out there who might be starting out on their own journey with design systems. Effectively, it contains all the information and knowledge that I've learned throughout my journey that I wish somebody just told me at the start of it. So Mothership's only been in production for a few months now, but it is starting to take shape. Our current foundations that we've got are spacing scales, spacing systems, typography styles, typography scales, grids, space colors, semantic colors, shadows and effects, and some tokenization. And we've even been able to start creating some core components as well, things like buttons and text inputs. And as it stands, we're just short of releasing a V1 of Mothership into the Figma community. Our aim would be to release that early next year. Not sure I wanted to commit to that on film, but I think I just have. And ultimately, beyond that, we want to continue to actually expand Mothership to reach outside of Figma, get it set up in platforms like Zero Height or Supernova, and really develop it as this educational and informative tool. Potentially, we might even get our YLD engineers involved and start realizing it within code so we can take it one step closer to becoming a truer design system. So just before I conclude this talk, I do have some closing comments, and they are mainly for myself back in 2017, so apologies if they're a bit personal. I said at the start that it had been a long and humbling journey, and to anybody starting out on that journey, I know it can seem impossible. It's very easy to look at other people's design systems work and think, I'll never be able to do that. It's too vast, it's too complicated, I don't understand, because those are all thoughts I've had throughout my journey. And actually, nearly everybody I've ever spoken to about design systems also seems to have had these thoughts at one stage or another. So it is really important to remember that you're not alone in having some of these thoughts and struggles. We're all on the same journey, we're just on different tracks. There is a fantastic design systems community out there who will support you. And a lot of the struggles that we do go through with design systems go unseen because we don't share them, but that doesn't mean they don't happen to all of us. So keep going. Design systems do demand a lot of blood and sweat and tears, but if you stick with them, you will get there. Thank you very much for listening. If you're interested in progress of Mothership, follow either myself or YLD for updates. Cheers.
If anybody has any questions for James.
Hey, you mentioned that one of the distinct features about this like open source design systems that you would find on the Figma community, for instance, is that it's really hard to understand all the decisions and the rationale behind the decisions that have been made. So how would you solve that for your open source design system?
So I think from our perspective, it's more about, obviously there are thousands of articles that will tell you why certain design decisions have been made. I think for us, it's about putting it in a context of being in a Figma file where you can actually read it, understand what it is, and then actually action it and do it kind of in the file. So I still think it's fundamentally the same thing as it being written down and in the file. But I think setting it up almost like a tutorial that's kind of ready and encourage the users to actually change it. Yeah, that's probably how we'd do it.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions? I have a question. Here we go. I'm ready. Yes, we have a question here. Actually, I'm going to walk over here, hand the microphone over. Here you go, my fine gentleman.
Thank you. Just wondered if you had any tips on ways to, or the best ways to get feedback from people on the design system. Like if people are using it and they want to suggest changes, how do you kind of gather that information and that feedback and action it?
That's an excellent question, which, as we haven't released it yet, I couldn't really give you a proper answer to. But yeah, I mean, obviously, it's something that we'll be constantly seeking feedback on. I don't have a good answer to that, to be honest.
So we have somebody else has an answer on that, I believe. Go for it. Okay, so hold that question for later. He's going to answer it afterwards. So we actually, for those of you who are super interested in understanding, is your design system giving you the result you need, and how do I understand this? There was a talk about this at a DSL conference not too far away on a YouTube channel from where you are. So again, plug in the YouTube channel, go back. I think we actually have the speaker in the audience, do we? Did you not talk about metrics? Oh yeah, you, yeah, Ellis, yeah. Oh, that old talk. Oh yeah, I remember that. So that was a great talk. Check that out. That's probably, I mean, I actually have one question. So you mentioned that we might potentially get engineers involved. How come we don't have engineers involved from the beginning when we set it up?
Because it initially came about very much from a design need and the kind of repetition of what we were doing in a lot of clients in terms of just putting in the same foundations over and over again, and it just meant that it slowed down the entire engagement, really, at least at the start. So from our perspective, it was just done almost in isolation from the design team of we need just a quicker way of doing this. Like, it's still going to be the same thing that we ultimately supply at the end to engineers for them to actually build. But we just need that kind of kickstart, basically. So yeah, obviously we will get them involved at some stage. It's just finding the right moment to get them involved.
Excellent. So for any Waldy engineers in the audience who want to get involved, or if you're watching online, because I'm sure you all are, let's get involved. We'll be talking about that in the next couple of weeks. James, I'm going to let you go here because we got to crack on. But thank you so much, and have a safe journey back on the train. It's trains in the UK, so who knows? Hopefully you're there before midnight. Thank you so much for coming, James. Thank you, James. This is an applaud. You are excused.